Hello everybody, in this video tutorial I would like to show you the next step. So in this video I'm going to show you how I use shadows blending with my airbrush. So because in the previous video tutorial I explained you how to use the midtones, just to don't confuse you about what kind of color you should use. So if in some moments you feel that I'm using a mid color, this is why I think that this color for me in this project will work as a shadow. That means that maybe another project will be a mid-tone. It's depend on what kind of colors you have on your model. So for that reason I want to explain it and split in two parts, the mid-tones with airbrush and the shadows. So for example, if you want to paint something with more magenta, maybe you have to use more blue inside of this magenta. So the result will be like a dark red or more violet. So be careful about that because it's very important. Think about the color. You have to use color with depth. Don't use black. That means if you are using black, the mistake at the end you will blend with gray colors over your colors. So if you have a beautiful turquoise, super saturated, and you spray over that with a black, your result will be like a grayish with turquoise, something like that. So be careful with that. For example, if you want to spray a complementary color in your shadows, be careful with that because, for example, if you have a violet and you want to use the complementary, will be yellow. So maybe you will have as a result a color like gray, brown, something like that, but maybe without depth. So be careful about that. So I recommend you use logical colors. If you are playing with blues, try to use darker blues. But darker blues means some of them with more magenta, violets, colors like that. Try to don't use orange or red, but maybe at the end you can use a darker violet or a blue plus black, but just in tiny places. You have to understand that the mid colors means the 90% of the model. The other 10%, the 80% maybe. So the 80 or 90% will be the midtones. So the rest of that, if you split the rest of the percent that you have it, for example, a 10% or a 5 will be for the highlights, and the other 10% or 5% will be for the deepest shadows. So for that reason, think about the midtones are really important. So at the beginning, I recommend you play with exactly the same colors or similar colors. That means if you are playing with blues, try to use different kind of blues. You don't have to use exactly the same color. You can use different colors like a blue plus green plus yellow plus magenta, something like that, but kind of blues. So then when you have finished with all these turquoise, blues, with violets, colors that have blue inside, then it's the moment to use weird colors, like maybe orange in some places, or different kind of violets, or maybe a green with a lot of yellow, something like that. And then after finish all the midtones and you blend it more or less well everything, it's the moment to use that kind of colors, darker tones. So these kind of colors will help you to define everything, every shape, where you have to paint them. You have to think that these colors, I'm going to use them just in a 5%, just that. So you have to choose what kind of places will be better. Because maybe if you want to spray this over the model, under the model, so above and below, maybe will be weird. So try to use them just below and in tiny places. Like for example, you are watching now, you can see how tiny is the shadow, but it's enough to paint, enough to represent the shape. Just that, you don't need something else. So with that, it's more than enough. How I recommend you play with this kind of colors. If you think that you are playing with a turquoise, in that case, use different kind of blues will work. But if you use magenta inside of them, will be darker and with more depth. So then, at the end, maybe you have to use like a dark violet to represent the deepest shadows. So the process will be always starting in the midtones and then bringing down this light to use darker colors. So this is how I work, because I think with my experience that is the correct way to do it. Maybe you can start with the darkest colors and then paint the lights. But what's the problem? If you painted too much with this kind of dark color, then you don't have the possibility to spray over that. Because if you have a white color, all the colors will be right over this. Like a red saturated, like every color saturated or darker or desaturated, all of them will work perfectly. However, if you are playing with, for example, a very, very dark violet, and then you try to spray a saturated red over that, maybe you won't get this light. So for that reason, I recommend you start with the midtones and then bringing down to paint the shadows. Okay. For example, now on his belly, you can see that I'm playing with a green and turquoise. The area with turquoise, it's because I would like to paint like a gradient between that white part through the skin tone of this turquoise. But the other area with more greens, it's because I would like to represent the refraction of the light over the plants, over the vegetables, on the earth, on this forest or this jungle. So for that reason, you have to understand, when you are painting a white color, you have to think that what kind of colors have this white, because it's not exactly the same paint a pure white without an ambient than put inside in an ambient this white. For example, if you have a white t-shirt walking around a beach, you have to think that if it's a sunny day, you will have different kind of yellows and orange on your clothes. So for that reason, maybe your highest lights will be pure white. But in my case, if I have to say my feelings, that I'm going to use a bit of yellow inside too. So never I'm going to use pure white, less I would like to represent like a bright, for example, from a non-metallic metal. The rest of the colors will be tinted from something, from the light of the ambient. Okay, so for that reason, I've decided to use this kind of greens on his belly too, to represent the ambient of this jungle, because the white color absorbs a lot the color. So think about that, because it's interesting, it's important, because a typical issue is when you paint everything well with a lot of colors like blues, greens, everything works perfectly, but then you are playing with white, and this white is just gray and white, just that. So it looks weird, because it's like you threw the ambient to another place on the white area. So for that reason, a copy tip that I can give you is try to add a bit of color inside of this white at the beginning, and just going to the highest light with the pure white, you will lose that color, that green, and will be perfect. That green in that case, okay, will be perfect to work with that. For example, if you see the teeth, if you see the mouth, the tongue, everything, I'm going to use something darker now. Maybe to represent this kind of darker colors, I'm going to use darker red, or maybe a blue, or maybe a violet. Will be depend of what kind of colors I want to represent. If I want a lot of depth, I'm going to use maybe violet or maybe blue, but the result maybe will look like black. So if you want to represent more like red color, I recommend you use a dark red, just that. So you can see what kind of colors I'm using, and this is how I work with airbrush. So think that you have to represent everything at the beginning with midtones, the logical midtones, then different colors just to test, to check if you like them or not, with glazing, with the copy glazing, with the airbrush, and then it's the moment to use darker colors. Again, logical colors at the beginning, different kind of blues in that case, blues with more green or different kind of greens, and then some of them with violet, for example. And then if you want to add some weird color, do it, but at the end, okay? Because if you try to move, for example, this turquoise to yellow, maybe the result at the end will be like green. So maybe you don't like green. Maybe if you want to do something like that, you have to make the setup from the scratch at the beginning. So you have to paint the light where you want, because maybe you want a light like yellow in some places. Just do it. Do it with your brush. And then with their brush, you can blend it or change something or make a gradient between the turquoise through the yellow part. But if you want to move all these colors to yellow, maybe can't be possible. So for that reason, be careful about what kind of colors you choose. So the choice about the colors, it's really, really important. How you have to choose them? Just test, because you can check a lot of information on Google and all of them will be right, but all of them will be different. So it's your taste, what you have to think. What kind of colors I use for that model? What do you want to represent? It's like a chaos warrior. Maybe if you play with yellow, maybe it's wrong. But maybe you want to paint I don't know, a human. So maybe you can play with all the colors. So some people mix or have yellow and another areas with green will work. And for another people will be different colors. So it's up to you. Choose the colors, test, and you will see if you like them or not. And then just play, enjoy. Okay, so the Mangler Squig is done, and now is the moment to paint the goblin. In that case, I would like to explain you something different, something completely different. So at the beginning, I started with this kind of green, and this is an example that what kind of finished we can do with our airbrush. In that case, I would like to move every kind of green completely different on every goblin. So in that case, I'm going to play with this kind of orange. In the same places as you, as human, you have like a magenta or areas with more red. For example, nose, cheek, hands, knuckles, elbow, stuff like that, okay? So, these kind of areas, I'm going to use orange. And why I've decided to use orange instead magenta? Because if you use magenta, for sure will be the complementary color and will be awesome. But the problem is that you will have like a gray finish or brown. If you're playing with orange, will be, if you want to understand it, like a red with a lot of yellow inside, okay? So it's like a complementary color, but not the perfect or correct complementary color. However, we'll have a lot of yellow inside and will be easier to control it over these kind of greens. So you can see how it changes. I'm trying to create nuances around all this green skin on the nose, cheek, knuckles, all these areas. And then if I want to use magenta or red, I'm going to use this kind of magenta red under that. So below, to paint something darker, a shadow. And why I've decided to do it like that? Because if you play with magenta over this green, you will desaturate everything. However, if you check some areas where I've painted with the highlights, you will see how this orange work a bit different. It's like, in some places I can see something more like yellow, something more like brown in other places. So the areas where you can see this is like a yellow or different kind of orange, not like green. It's because when you want to paint the highlights, you are using lighter colors. So every kind of this color will have more white inside. So the result will look easier to represent with the color. So if you are painting with green, with orange, you will move this green to a desaturated green. But in the places where you have more white, maybe you will have more yellow inside of that or more orange. So in that kind of places, will be really, really interesting play with red, because you have now like a different background. You have something more like orange or yellow where you will work over that. So you will play with this magenta in places where you have more yellow and less green. So you will play with this magenta in places where you have less complementary color. So this is like a tricky, okay? And this is how I work. First, I create a new base coat or different nuances going to the color that I need it, and then use magenta or red. If you use magenta from scratch at the beginning, straight, maybe the result will be less than if you play at the beginning with orange and then with magenta. Another capi tip. Okay, check that part. So at the beginning, I used this kind of orange to change the color, to change the tonalities on his face and on his skin. And now I'm using this kind of blues. Why? Because I wanted to change more and more and more the tonalities of his skin. But in that case, I'm going to use that kind of blue to represent mid colors, but with more depth. So I don't want to understand them as a shadow. I want to understand that colors as a different depth. So for that reason, I said you have to understand the midtones, like 80% of your model, 10% will be the highlights, and 10% will be the darkest color. So if you are playing in a 80% of colors, you have a full options to paint like you want it. So if you understand that this blue will move the color to something farther, it's because you understand that a cold color it's perfect to represent as a depth on your tonalities. So you can work on your midtones with warm colors and cold colors. So at the beginning, I'm using a warm colors to change the tonalities easier on the cheek, nose, something like that. But now I'm using this blue to change the tonalities in places where I want to use something darker. But I don't want to use a shadow because I'm going to keep the shadow in a 5%. So I have the key or the option to use a cold color to move these colors far away from my model. So farther, just using blue or using a colder green. But if I use colder green, will be more shy. It's like, I'm moving a bit, but not enough. If I use something like blue, in my opinion, will be easier to control it because green, it's the mix between yellow and blue. So if you're playing with colors with more yellow, like this orange, and colors with more blue, you can use turquoise too, for example, will be easier to control these kind of greens. And this is how I work, and this is why you can see a lot of tonalities on his skin. And after this, painting the black areas on his clothes just will be done. So you don't have to do much more for these goblins. I think it will be a really, really fun project to paint it. I don't know who will be the the painter that want to paint all this project, but if you do it, will be really, really interesting. You will have fun painting that. It's really fun model to paint it. So as you can see, on the rest of the goblins is more or less the same, just blending with midtones and shadows, changing everything. Not everything, but trying to change and add more and more and more information with the colors. So you don't have to play only with yellow if you are painting on a yellow surface. You can play with different kind of orange, reds, greens, all the colors that you can imagine. But at the beginning, as I said, start with the midtones, with the color that you have on your model. If you have green, different kind of greens. If you have yellow, different kind of yellow. If you have red, different kind of red. So this is at the beginning. Then, if you have yellow and you want to play with violet, because someone told you that the complementary color is the correct way to do it, just test. But you will see the result. Maybe it will look like brown. If you have brown, Maybe you have the perfect brown that you want to use it. Maybe the brown that you like it have orange inside. So use a brown with orange. You don't have to use the complementary color for everything. It's just to something, but just a bit. So I'm trying to explain you the easiest way to paint and why I work on that way. First, because it's easier, and to me, because it's smarter. Because if you know the result, just go to the result. You don't have to use the complementary color every time because you want to represent something gray. If you want something gray, just try to use colors to move to that place. Easy. If you want something like brown on your yellows, just use the brown that you want it, because the brown that you want maybe have more green inside. So try to use green inside of that brown and you have the correct color that you want. This is how I understand the painting, and this is how I would like to translate to you. For example, on this kind of gold, I could use violet and will work perfectly, but maybe the result will be more or less the same. But in some places where I have more white, you will see perfectly the violet, and maybe it's not the correct color that I would like to show you on my gold. So for that reason, I can use that kind of brown with more orange, or in some places with more green, and will work much better than violet. But in my case, because I will like add more and more colors to have more tonalities. If you want to lose the tonalities, for sure you can play with the complementary colors. You have a bunch of ways to paint. So every model, every project could be completely different. If you want to play in a project with complementary colors, just do it. Just do it. So you have a bunch of ways to paint. So you don't have only one way to paint. This is how I work on that project, but in another projects I'm going to use different ways. So every project is a different and single project. So there isn't a only way to paint everything. And the way to paint like that, it's because I love it, okay? So, okay, what happened about inks? Why I use inks on my model? This is because I would like to have a glossy finish, just for that. If you want to have a satin or matte finish on your leather, don't use inks, don't make sense. So you can use every color that you want it. But if you want to have something more like this, like glossy, just use inks. If at the beginning you have something like satin, you can reinforce them painting another layer, like you can see here, okay? So this is how I work. Why? Because at the end you will have glossy finished in some places, satin finished in another places, and matte finished in another places. You will have different 3 kind of finishes on your model. And I use this kind of tiny stippling, or I try to paint this kind of dots to represent the darkest and mid-tones areas with the inks. So this is how I have more control. I'm better with my brush on that way. Okay, so this was everything. I hope you have enjoyed watching this video tutorial about how to paint the darkest colors with the airbrush and how to work with the inks and the rest of the stuff on your models. And I hope to surprise you with the next video tutorial about the brush to paint the highlights, the key. So every project is different, and I hope you have enjoyed watching this one, and see you in the next one. Okay, thank you very much and see you. Bye bye.